Alright, I'm sure if you're clicking on this, you don't need me to read the first paragraph of Brockhampton's Wikipedia, so I'm just gonna get into it. After radio silence for most of 2020, Brockhampton released their single Buzz Cut, and 2 weeks later, the album it's attached to is here. I enjoy a lot of Brockhampton's discography, so I'm pretty excited to see what this new album is like. The title is Roadrunner, Old Light, New Machine, and without further ado, let's get into it. The first track, Buzz Cut, is a pretty great opener. Kevin has a pretty strong verse here, and Danny Brown guests with an amazing, tongue-in-cheek verse. The song also transitions to a more cinematic sounding section, which works well as well. It's a pretty great intro to the album, and reminds me of a more fleshed out version of the technical difficulty stuff they were doing last year. We then transition to Chain On, which actually was from the technical difficulties series last year, but this time with an additional verse from Don McLennan. The song features JPEG Mafia, who spits a pretty great verse, and I mean any That's So Raven reference is appreciated. I think my main problem with the song is something that a lot of the technical difficulties stuff had, which is that it feels like demos, and even if they bop, don't feel fully realized. It's still a good track on its own though. We then get to Count On Me, which can also be traced back to the technical difficulties stuff, but I won't say this feels like a demo. Instead, my main complaint is that this is just pretty forgettable. A$AP Rocky gives a good verse, and Shawn Mendes, Ryan Beatty, and Jabari give a smooth hook, but this just doesn't stick out in my memory at all. Also, Jabari, who's producing on previous albums, is a vocalist on this album and does a pretty good job. Next up is Bankroll with A$AP Rocky and Ferg, and it's a pretty good track. We get verses from Ferg, Merlin, Jabari, and all of them are pretty good. It sounds like something off of Iridescence, which actually makes sense because it traces all the way back to an Iridescence promotional video. I think it's also important to talk about how Brockhampton frames guests on this project. On previous albums, they would have the guest appear for a chorus or even their own song like Heaven Belongs to You, which I think helped add to the collaborative nature of those albums. But on Roadrunner, it's usually just a verse with a credit in the title and all. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it helps represent the album is a lot less collaborative than their previous work. Kevin has stated in interviews that he's kind of tired of the whole boy band thing, which probably explains the change. And I should also say that this isn't inherently a bad thing. I just think it doesn't help my criticisms, which I'll get into later on. The next track is The Light, which is the first track that really gives me an idea of what Roadrunner is. It has Joba talking about losing his father to suicide and trying to cope with that trauma, and Kevin talking about his experience back in Texas. To be honest, this feels like the true start of the album to me, and even with the grim subject matter, these are 2 of the best verses on the album. We then get Windows with So Gone So Flexi, who is a Corpus Christi rapper recently signed Kevin and Romeo's label. He has contributions scattered across the album. And getting to the track, I actually like it quite a bit. It reminds me of something like Sweet, where the vibe is that everyone is freestyling and hyping each other up. It keeps the momentum for all 6 verses, and it's the track that probably feels the most like everyone's in the same room crafting the track together. Next up is I'll Take You On with famous R&B singer Charlie Wilson. I don't have much to say about this beyond that it's basically just a jam with a great hook. So instead, I'll use this time to explain why I'm bringing up collaboration so much. On this project, some of the members definitely get sidelined. Merlin is only on 4 of the tracks, and Bareface and Dom are only on 5. And again, I don't think this is a bad thing, but I think it just doesn't help with my criticisms, which I'll get into later. For now, let's get into the next track, Old News with Bayard. And it's kind of a miss. Bard does a fine job, but the rest of the members don't do all that much of interest, and the instrumental is probably the worst on the album. Kevin credited Bayard with producing and shaping the sound of Roadrunner behind the scenes, and that's all I can really find on him. Like I said, he does a good job. Thankfully, it's one of the shortest songs on the album, so we can move on and get to What's the Occasion, which is almost purely Joba with a Matt verse in there. Now, Joba feels like the emotional centerpiece of this album, so I think it makes sense to have a track with only him on it. And I also enjoy him a lot on this album, so I enjoyed this quite a bit. It's got a good groove, and it's simple, but it just works. Again, not much to say, but I just like it. The next track, When I Ball, has Dom and Matt reminiscing about life. It's a moment of calm before we get back into the rest of the Scattered album, and I think it works really well. There's good verses, there's a good chorus, and it's just a good song all around. Don't Shoot Up the Party is a G-Funk influenced banger about reaching your breaking point and how you shouldn't quote-unquote shoot up the party. It's kind of messy, but it's an interesting enough idea to keep you in it through the entire track. The second to last track is Dear Lord, and it's just Bareface singing a hymn, and it's a fine thing to put before the final track of the album. It's decently enjoyable, and I think it fits the themes of the record quite well. Getting to the last track on the album, The Light Part 2 is a continuation of The Light, and is probably my favorite track on the album. It continues the ideas from the verses in the first part, and feels like a resolution to Joba and Kevin's inner turmoil. Alright, so you might have picked up on this during the review, but this thing feels like a mess. Part of that I think is intentional because of how crazy our hell world is right now, but part of it feels like the album just can't focus on one idea. And walking away from the album, I have no idea what Roadrunner is. Throughout the album, there's constant references to the light. In an interview, Joba has stated that the light is more of an idea of hope at the end of a dark time, and I think the album somewhat builds on this idea, but since it can barely focus on one member, it's hard to connect with. Also, sonically, I could not tell you what Roadrunner sounds like. It's all over the place. The first 4 tracks sound like technical difficulties. The 2 light tracks sound rock influenced. There's a hymn, there's a G-funk track, there's a classic Kanye sounding track. It's just really baffling. Of course, variety isn't a bad thing, and don't get me wrong, I like probably 2/3 of the songs on here, but when there's so little stringing it together, it's hard to enjoy this as a complete project.